Sometimes the simplest of mistakes pass by with no fallouts, but sometimes the simplest of mistakes have the gravest of consequences. Let me tell you the story of Ryan Barnes and how his simple mistakes were the reason to his fall. Ryan Barnes, a 39-year-old husband, father, and ex-Marine. With nothing but a high school diploma, Ryan's choices after the Marines were so limited, and he eventually settled as a truck driver. Even though it wasn't paying enough, Ryan found it an easy income as it doesn't require any specific skills from him other than driving. With his 6 years active duty severance pay and a little help from truck driving, he was able to buy a small house in the suburbs through a payment plan. He settled in it with Penny Brooks, his very kind wife that Ryan doesn't deserve, and his only daughter Kate. When Ryan ended his service at 24, he felt his life was empty and he always had an unsettling feeling. He was dragged from Marine Company to his late parents' house. He had no siblings or friends outside the army, and he was so desperate to start a family. But then he met Penny at a diner she used to work at, and after a year worth of drama, they were married. To look so far into Ryan's life, you would expect that his life is going to get better, even though it should, but Ryan's own actions would ruin his life. It was 6:36 a.m. when Ryan woke up to the crisp smell of sausages and was immediately drawn out of bed. He made a necessary stop at the bathroom and was now washing his face. He looked up to see his unappealing reflection, unshaven face, bed hair that's thinning out, and bloodshotted eyes from last night. His mirror had seen better days, but all of that was a problem to worry about later. Now, it was coffee time. He headed to the kitchen and found Penny by the stove pan-frying sausages to perfection. He greeted her good morning, but in return she only just gave him the cold shoulder. Ryan flinched to her response and decided to brush it off. Penny turned from the stove and served Ryan breakfast. Ryan thanked Penny and hoped it would soften the harsh vibe that was rolling around, but still she didn't even look at him. He started digging on his plate and refused to give up, starting to talk about his old Silverado and how he needs to visit the auto shop frequently for it to go anywhere. But then Penny was still giving him the silent treatment. He was still consistent on trying to get something out of her, and this time he tried a joke, telling her at least his car isn't as ancient and crappy as their neighbor Ronald. Ryan forced a laugh but quickly stopped as Penny was still on her business and not paying any attention to him. Ryan had enough of it. He immediately switched to his grumpy and argumentative tone and asked her what was the matter. She finally confronted him about the fact that he knew yesterday was a planned family night that Kate desperately needed. Ryan felt anger rising from within, but that wasn't all. She confronted him about coming home at 2 a.m. drunk. She confronted him about drunk driving from his friend's house and not having any responsibility for his life and others, and told him it wouldn't matter as she and Kate were used to him not being around. Ryan bursted out in anger after her last sentence and told her that it was just a fun night out and he was planning to get home eventually. They kept arguing like that for what felt like eternity, until Ryan shouted, "Screw family night if it meant fun for me." And just when he finished that sentence, the front door slammed shut. It was Kate leaving to school. Ryan couldn't hold the poison in his mouth and blamed Penny and said that it's all her fault. Penny shook her head in disbelief, grabbed Kate's lunch and chased after her. Ryan chugged his coffee and wore his shoes and got out. He saw from afar Penny saying something to Kate before hugging her. He scouted and got into his Silverado and hit the road. Ryan's job wasn't so far from home as he lived in the suburbs. It was a 20-minute drive to work. Ryan got a daily routine when arriving: check in, greet the boys, get into the appointed truck, and hit the road. His days were boring as heck, driving in straight roads for what sometimes adds up to 7 hours. 7 hours full of honking, road rages, and a little Boba 2, Boba 3 between truck radios. But what Ryan really was excited about was when he'd return to the supplier and end his shift. After their last debate, Ryan decided he would spend the rest of the evening gambling at the poker table with Stanley, his high school friend that was also a victim of his own life's bad choices. On his way back, he planned to make a stop at the market and buy a rack of beers for their night. He pulled over and got in, grabbed his rack, and went to check in. He found behind the counter a teenage girl all gloomy and angsty. Ryan thought it was funny to comment and tell her that when considering jobs that involve human interactions, it would be nicer if she'd smile more. He snorted a laugh so hard his belly moved with it. He grabbed his beers and got out. He drove his way to Stanley's house, and together they spent their night wasting both money and brain cells. After a couple of chugs and losing 3/4 of his bettings, he decided it was time to go home. It was 11 p.m. and he was almost drunk. Driving home is definitely not an option for a rational being. But it's Ryan. He drove home dangerously over the speed limits. He passed a couple of red lights, and when he reached their block, he rammed something and his car screeched to a stop in front of their house. He slowly and unsteadily stepped out of the car. He looked at the road to see what he rammed, and he wished he didn't. It was their neighbor's cat, Millie, crushed and flattened. Ryan put a hand to his temples. He already had history with DUI. If Ronald were to report this, he'd be fined, and his license taken away. He could kiss his job goodbye. He thought quickly and decided to hide it initially at the back of his yard. He stumbled his way to the back door and got in. He was surprised when he found Penny facing him. She confronted him about coming home late and drunk driving again, and this time he was covered in dirt. He drunkenly told her to leave him alone and that he needs to rest. She looked searchingly into him and asked him where's the Ryan that she knew, that nice and organized man she knew. Ryan couldn't think straight as he was clearly wasted, but he couldn't help but think about what she said, but quickly brushed her words off and told her that she's overreacting. She looked sadly into his eyes and told him at least not to miss Katie's birthday after tomorrow. Ryan tried not to act surprised and just nodded unsteadily. She helped him walk his way to his bed, and just when he was about to sleep, a blurry dark figure was looking over him. But before he could react in any way, he fell deep into sleep. Ryan woke up disoriented in a pool of his own sweat. He was desperately trying to catch his breath. He had a very disturbing nightmare, but he couldn't remember a lot of it, other than a building that represents his family crumbling down, and a dark, blurry figure creeping on him. It took him a while until he got a hold of himself and got out of bed. Today's morning wasn't full of arguments like yesterday. They all sat in the same table and had breakfast, quietly. After yesterday's night, Ryan started reconsidering his ways and how he changed into a bad father, husband, or a person in general. He knew he had to change some habits too. It'll just take time. When they had their breakfast, Penny was eyeing Ryan and nodding toward Kate, who was leaving to school. It took Ryan a moment to realize, and he asked Kate if she wanted him to drive her to school today. She replied with a plain no. Ryan flinched when he realized how distant he became with Kate, that his presence in the house was like a stranger. He stood up and walked toward her. Kate stiffened her arms by her sides, and Penny was preparing to move in, but unexpectedly, Ryan wrapped his arms around Kate and kissed her head. He promised her that things would be different. She looked considering for a moment and cautiously hugged him back. When she was leaving, he called after her using her old name Kit Kat. He asked her wasn't her violin recital today. She tried not to look surprised and cautiously say yeah, her to expect him to be there, this time for real. She tried quickly to hide a smile and left. Ryan let out a deep breath and looked at Penny, who was smiling warmly at him. Ryan chugged his coffee, hugged Penny, and hit the road. His day at work was surprisingly smooth and not as usually boring. He even stopped at 4 traffics instead of 7. The weather was nice, but so was his mood. Everything was unusual, well except for one thing. He was still excited for his shift to end, but not for poker night. Instead, it was Kate's recital. After dropping by the supplier, Ryan hit straight to Kate's school. Penny couldn't come by as she worked overtime on Fridays, but Ryan promised to record everything for her. Ryan got into the auditorium, and after a couple of minutes of preparations, it was time. Kate was doing a piano-accompanied violin solo that gave Ryan, and obviously the whole audience, chills every time she hits a high note, then professionally sees into a low note. The show overall was breathtaking. She even noticed him mid-playing and smiled. After the show, Ryan expressed to her how beautiful her performance was and that he's proud. He then offered to celebrate by going to the ice cream shop, which Kate could not possibly argue. They drove to the shop and got their ice cream and was now heading home. On their way back, Ryan started to feel dizzy, and upon realizing that his vision was fading into darkness, he tried to pull over, but to no avail. His body was paralyzed and he felt numb. Suddenly, Ryan felt a heavy, dark presence beside him in the passenger seat. He tried to look his direction, but he couldn't. His eyes were fixed to the void ahead of him. He started to quietly panic and was trying desperately to move. But then a slow, steady and sad voice talked. It wasn't exactly talking, but rather a supernatural version of it. It was coming from the entity's direction. It called Ryan's name and told him that his time has come. It is time to go. In the blink of an eye, Ryan was seeing himself from the passenger seat. He was turning and stopping on traffic and normally driving, but something was off. He looked expressionless and dead. He couldn't talk, he couldn't move, he couldn't look away. He was just there looking at the zombified version of himself. The entity introduced itself as Death, and Ryan felt bloodless and his face went pale. He hoped this was just a bad dream, but it wasn't. He knew for a fact it wasn't. He could feel it, the dread, and that unexplainable feeling of knowing that this is real. Death told Ryan that he made a lot of heavy mistakes in his life that led his fate to be sealed, at least unless he can fix them. He told him he has until tomorrow to fix them. If he couldn't, then it's time to go. In a blink of an eye, Ryan was back into his body and Kay was talking, as if she'd been on that conversation for minutes. Was he hallucinating? Did the years of drinking finally caught up to him? Did he lose his mind? But still, he couldn't possibly convince himself that wasn't real. It had to be. When they got home, they all had dinner together and played Kate's violin recital on TV. Penny was so touched with Kate's violin play and told her how proud of her she was. They spent the rest of the night planning Kate's birthday tomorrow. They decided they'll have it at Frederick's Fake Bear's Pizzeria. After their night concluded, Ryan made his night routines and headed out to bed. Finally, he could drop the calm facade he was putting up for them. It was time to question his sanity. Ryan was thinking in bed for hours about what possible heavy mistakes he could have done in his life. He reflected on his life the past weeks, months, years, but that's no brainer. He knew exactly what mistakes were those. Killing Millie, wasting his money at poker, being rude with everyone, being a bad husband, and of course, being negligent and avoidant to his only daughter when she needed him the most. After identifying all those things about him, he felt as if they were eating up on him. He was full of regret and consumed by guilt. If only he acknowledged them in different circumstances. He knew he had to fix them all in one day. He'd be erasing death. The next day, Ryan was in a hurry to leave. He skipped breakfast. Penny asked him where he was going early Saturday morning. He told her that the warehouse is offering extra hours. That was true in a way, except that the extra hours don't start until 12 p.m. He wished if he wouldn't lie to Penny anymore, but there was no way he was going to tell her the truth. She looked at him suspiciously, then nodded, and reminded him half-heartedly not to miss Kate's birthday party tonight. He assured her and told her he'd be late, but he'll be there in time. She mock glared at him for a moment, and he assured her with a promise, and she smiled. He kissed her head and left. His first step was to apologize to Ronald about Millie. The poor man stapled a bunch of images of the cat into poles in hopes someone would find her. Ryan went to his house and rang the doorbell. A kind old man answered the door. It was Ronald. He cheerfully greeted Ryan good morning and offered him inside. Ryan wasn't so sure if he wanted to get inside. After visually turning down his request, he asked him how he can help him today, and Ryan used that window as a point to start. He told him about that night and apologized from the deepest of his heart and asked for his forgiveness. Ronald was so shocked and surprised that he was speechless the whole time. But then his expression softened and he faintly smiled. He told him that what he did was vile and inexcusable, but what happened, happened, and he shall not carry any grudge against the person who apologized for his mistakes. Ryan was dying from the inside with guilt and regret. The poor old man was still being kind to him after what he did. Together, they probably buried Millie, and Ryan felt that unnatural presence once again. But as soon as he whirled around, it disappeared. Ryan apologized again to Ronald and left. Next, he had to make amends for his gambling habits. He made a stop by the pawn shop. He had to sell his most treasured item, his Glock 19 and his precious AR-15. It was a premium customized model, identical to his back in the Marines. He spent most of his savings to buy and maintain the piece. But if he had to make up to his gambling, he had to sell it. They settled at $4,700 for both of them. Ryan was hesitant when he was handing his AR to the dealer. He finally gave him and took the money and left without looking back. Now he had to put the money for the good to where his gambling money should have gone. He returned home and found Kate in the living room watching TV. He greeted her good morning and asked where Penny was. She told him she's in the kitchen, so he went there and found her. Penny was surprised to find him and asked him why he came back early. He told her it's a long story and handed her the money. He told her that he sold his arms and told her to put this for Kate's college savings. She was speechless for a moment, then asked him why wouldn't he put them. He lied to her and told her he had a long way to overcome gambling and he wouldn't trust himself with the money. She looked worried and asked him if everything was okay. He smiled sadly and assured her everything is, and that he's just reordering his priorities. She smiled at him, he hugged her, and told her he needs to get back to work. He ruffled Kate's hair on his way out, and before leaving he wished her a happy birthday. Next, he had a specific person to apologize to, someone whom Ryan used their sadness for his laugh, the cashier girl. He went to the market and bought Kate's birthday gifts, ranging from stuffed animals to snacks to other stuff Kate liked. He went to check up and he was so grateful that the girl was working Saturdays. She was scanning his stuff and wasn't minding looking at him. He cleared his throat and told her that she probably doesn't remember him. She looked up and her reaction told Ryan that she did. He apologized for being rude with her last time and for not being considerate to other people's problems. She chuckled and shook her head. She told him not to worry about it as she meets a lot of rude people and he might be the first one she remembered apologizing. She forgave him and told him that it's cool. He felt a rush of relief flowing from within. He asked her if he can ask what was the matter back then. She looked hesitant at first but then told him that her father grew sick and she had to freeze her entry to college to work here. Ryan held a sympathetic gaze and told her everything will be fine. He drew his wallet and paid for his things and tipped her $300. He told her he hoped this would help and wished her father to get well soon. She thanked him and then was just speechless. He smiled, took his stuff, and left. The last thing he had to do was attend Kate's birthday, and he had just the time to drive there. The pizzeria where the party will be is a 30-minute drive from where he was. It was 8:23 p.m., almost 24 hours since that death experience. But he was so relieved he changed and fixed a lot of things in time. He got into his car and hit the road. He was so excited to end all of this and get back to his new refreshing life. The life that he wished for, even though it might take time to turn things around, but all he has to do is keep Penny and Kate's trust and stick by their side when they need him. Ryan was driving on a straight highway. It was dark except for a light pole that lighted his car for a second as he passed by it, and it was almost empty. But Ryan felt something strange. It's been more than an hour since he's been driving, and he just realized he couldn't see further to his right nor left. The highway was in a void. Suddenly, the same unnatural low voice called. As much as Ryan was afraid, he was still glad he fixed all things. He told Death that he did his part of the deal. Now it's his turn. Death kept silent for a moment. It made Ryan consider if he was hallucinating. But then in a deep yet calm tone, Death chuckled. He told Ryan that indeed he fixed his mistakes, at least the recent ones. He reminded him not to forget about his past, That dark, specific past he had. Ryan's face went pale and his heart fell to the floor. Death continued reminding Ryan about his past in the Marines, the hundreds of innocent lives he took just because he was reckless, and how he knowingly violated deployment codes. Ryan was now panicking, just as he was so certain. In a panic, Ryan asked Death to give him more time and he'll fix them too. Death interrupted with a loud, rumbling laugh that shook Ryan from the inside and told him it's time to go. Ryan was begging Death not to take him, at least not until he attended Kate's birthday. He begged and begged, but Death was silent. And in a blink of an eye, Ryan was face to face with Death. All around was just a foggy darkness. Ryan couldn't speak anymore, he couldn't move anymore, he couldn't look away anymore. All he could do was let Death's eyes burn into his. Death said in a chilling tone, "Ryan Barnes, if you were to survive this, I will let you go." He stared at Ryan for a minute and told Ryan he'll see him soon, before fading with the fog. Ryan was back at the highway. His car was slowly swerving and it was dangerously speeding. He tried riding it, but he felt numb and weak. He couldn't move. His vision was blurring out too. He knew he was done for it. All he had to do was wait and see himself die. Everything was silence, all but his memories. Memories about playing at his parents' house. Memories about the young eager man he was. Memories about days with Penny. Memories of Kay's first words. His eyes were tearing. He wanted to wipe them off, but he couldn't, as he couldn't feel his hands. All he could feel was regret, guilt, sadness, and impact.